Okay, great. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to introduce Dr. Nacoste and set the stage for our event, and then turn it over to him, who will be doing 99% of the talking, as it should be. And that is including answering your questions. So please do start typing into the Q&A portion of the screen when those occur to you, so we have some to answer. I won't make this too long because we want to get to hear him. Dr. Rupert Nacoste was born into the Jim Crow South in the Louisiana Bayou when discrimination was the law of the land. After graduating from college, he served in the Navy when race riots were breaking out on naval ships, including the ship he served on. And he found his calling to be a social psychologist, helping people deal with diversity in society during that time. He's the alumni distinguished undergraduate professor of psychology at NC State University here in Raleigh. He's taught there since 1988, has received numerous teaching awards, including the UNC Board of Governors Teaching Excellence Award. In 2006, he developed a unique course, which is now called Interdependence and Race. And when I talk to students who have taken that course, I almost always hear the term life-changing. I met Dr. Nacoste in a different capacity many years ago as a regular customer here at Quail Ridge Books. The first conversation I remember was when he brought a stack of Louise Penny books up to the counter, and we started talking, and that's how I discovered her as an author. And we've had many, many book-related conversations since then, and we could easily, and maybe we will, have a whole nother webinar of his recommendations for all sorts of different reading for pleasure. As I got to know him better, I started to informally consult with him on some controversial author events at the store and other current issues. I always appreciated his thoughtful approach, his encouragement of the store to present controversial authors and subjects across the political spectrum. When his book, Taking on Diversity, How We Can Move from Anxiety to Respect, came out, that was in 2015, he and I worked together to put on a series of community forums we called What's Going On, from the Marvin Gaye song, I'm sure you remember, that's still so relevant today, to help people learn how to cope with anxiety over a rapidly changing society. Dr. Nacoste doesn't just teach a life-changing course and write life-changing books. He also travels the country addressing schools, from middle schools to universities. Mostly schools who are grappling with diversity challenges, sometimes because of hate incidents that have recently occurred. As I read his new book, To Live Woke, Thoughts to Carry in Our Struggle to Save the Soul of America, that's that one right there, just out, I kept thinking, if everybody could read this book or take his class, we would be in such a better place in this country. And if we can each learn tools to examine our own prejudices, and we all have them, and respond effectively when confronted with the prejudices or bigotry of those with whom we interact, we can counteract some of the hateful rhetoric we hear so frequently. I think we're extremely fortunate to have someone of Dr. Nacoste's ability and experience who's willing to give of his time and energy so generously to improve the life of our community. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Nacoste to read a portion of the book and answer a few of my questions and then your questions. Dr. Nacoste.
Thank you, Sarah. And thanks to Quail Ridge Books for sponsoring this virtual event for my book, To Live Woke. To Live Woke is 46 short essay chapters. I wrote and crafted it that way because there's so many American us versus them topics that connect to our nation's neurodiversity situation. I also put it together in small bits to give the reader psychological space and pauses to process these topics that do cause tension. Tonight, right now, I'm going to read a portion of chapter 1, What's the Question? Violence is not the answer. June 12, 2016, Orlando Post Club, 50 shot dead in a safe haven for gays and lesbians. July 5th, 2016. Weeks later, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Alton Sterling, a black man is killed by a white policeman. July 6, 2016, a day later, in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, Philandro Castile, another black man is killed by a white policeman. The incident is live streamed on Facebook. Protests erupt all over America. July 7th, 2016, another day later in Dallas, a black sniper kills 5 policemen at one of those peaceful protests against police shootings of Black men. Violence is not the answer, America cried out that summer of 2016. America was in shock. I was in shock. After all that I have seen and lived through, even I was in shock the weekend of July 5th, 2016. A Black male born in 1951 in Deep South Jim Crow legally segregated Louisiana. I have seen so much. I was 12 when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. I was 15 when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were put into national law. April 4th, 1968, I was 17 years old, lying on the couch that evening as my mother walked out of the door to head to Holy Ghost Catholic Church to play bingo. News said Martin Luther King Jr. has been assassinated. I jumped up from the couch, ran to the door and called out to my mother. She had the driver's side door open and was about to get in our car. When I called out, she stopped and looked up at me. I said, "They killed him." That's all I said. My mother knew exactly what I was talking about. I was still 17 when presidential candidate Robert Bobby Kennedy was assassinated that June 1968. In the Navy, in 1973, at 22 years of age, I served on board the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid that exploded into a race riot that lasted for 3 days at sea. All that, and yet the summer of 2016, I was reeling. Along with the rest of America, I was in shock. Then my expertise as a social psychologist and sense of social responsibility both kicked in. For me, being shocked was not enough. Yes, same as other Americans, I wondered, how can I help? What can I do? Well, I knew it wasn't going to be as a protester, not at this point in my life. My help would be to use my expertise to show America what was really going on, to help Americans ask and seek answers to the right questions. In my teaching, I was already doing that as a professor. I teach one of the only, if not the only, college course that can help individuals have productive social interactions in these difficult days of neoliberal America. You see, today, we are living in the difficult days that Martin Luther King Jr. prophesied in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. In that last speech sermon, he said, "I don't know what's going to happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead." At North Carolina State University, my interdependence and race course is the only one in the world that shows people how to understand and analyze what is going on in their everyday interpersonal interactions in these difficult days of bold prejudice and bigotry. I say that mine is the only course that can do this because I know of no other that begins by describing the current interpersonal intergroup situation of America. Courses taught by others in my discipline or from other disciplines either go straight into individual psychology or broad social structural issues and dynamics. That is why course is not grounded in the concept of neo-diversity. Leave people with only vague ideas, post-racial, and ways of talking, white privilege, that shut down rather than open up authentic dialogue. Without describing the everyday interpersonal intergroup situation people are being confronted with, without then analyzing those interpersonal intergroup situations, you cannot give people the interpersonal guidance, how am I supposed to interact, that they are in need of and are struggling to find. That is the first goal of my course. To state it bluntly, my course is the only one in the world that asks and answers this question: how is an interpersonal interaction influenced when one or both people are or become aware that the two people are different from each other by some group identity? Race, yes, but and also religion, sex of person, bodily condition, gender identity, ethnicity, sexual orientation, mental health condition, age, money condition, political affiliation. Turns out, you see, not knowing how to have respectful social interactions with a person not like me is what is tearing at the soul of America. created by me in 2006 in my unique interdependence and race course, I take social psychological research and translate it into strategies for productive neurodiverse social interactions that anyone can learn. I was able to create my course by combining my scholarship with my past real-world experience of intense intergroup experiences in the United States Navy. During my military service, while with racial tensions swirling throughout, I was trained to and became a facilitator of racial dialogues to help the Navy deal with racial problems that sometimes reached the level of riot aboard ships. I did the work to create my interpersonal relationships and race course because I knew that what I would teach would help my students come out of anxiety and avoidance to engage in authentic social interactions with people not like me. Years ago, I had done that kind of social justice work in the Navy. I had done that with sailors aboard ships at sea. No doubt, I could create a course that would help college students lift their heads and to change lives by showing them how and why they have made mistakes and how to do better. At the end of the spring 2018 course, for example, a student wrote this: I have now been given the tools to analyze and think more deeply about the dynamics of interpersonal intergroup interactions and not rush to dismiss people. I am an American, and I am so thankful that this course has opened my eyes to the inclusive breadth of what that truly means. But not just in my classroom. I also see positive effects of teaching young people about neurodiversity, even when I just give a one-shot guest lecture. After my April 12th, 2018 College of Public Health Ramsey lecture at the University of Georgia, a student wrote this: one thing I appreciated about Dr. Nacoste's lecture was that he took the time to define a few terms that are thrown around so often in our society today. I think we have lost sight of what they mean. He talked about racism in terms of structure, which is often overlooked in pop culture and media, who would rather blame individual entities for inequity because it is more sensational and easier to comprehend. He also defined bigoted as having a negative view of an entire group of people. This was definitely a good reminder for me to watch how I think about and generalize about other people. So hear me then. We can save the soul of America, but to do so, we must all face the unavoidable realities of neurodiversity, and we must see our way to ask and address the questions that neurodiversity brings into our everyday social interactions. Violence is not the answer, went out the cries summer 2016. Wait, what is the question? We need to know the question before we can find the answer. Who are among the we and who are among the they is the neurodiversity question haunting the soul of America, fading in and out of our lives every day, all day. That is the question. We are and always have been in a struggle for the soul of America. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal is that soul. Our American struggle then is how to live in that spirit every day as we encounter and interact with each other.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Nacoste. You touched on this a little bit, neodiversity. Why is it important to differentiate that from the diversity we all hear about? What is neodiversity and what's its importance? You coined that term, I think.
Yes, I did. So one of the things about the way I approach this is I see America going through stages of dealing with issues related to race, gender, and so on. For a time, we talked a lot about race relations. Then we added we started talking about diversity to add women's issues. And then this interesting thing happened that people weren't quite paying attention to: the mix of people growing in this country and the mix of people we had to interact with. So what I'm talking about with neodiversity is the interaction situation. It's not about categories of people. I'm not counting how many groups there are. I'm saying that there is an interpersonal situation that is neurodiversity that puts demands on us every day as we try to move about the day.
So that's really anybody who doesn't feel like me is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, when we were walking around a lot more than we are now, walking into Target, walking into a coffee shop, walking into, our American context for who we encounter changed. And that's what neurodiversity is describing. Who is in Cup of Joe, who is in Starbucks, and who is in a park, and who is allowed to be in. You notice these stories that are coming up that are everywhere now. Somebody's calling the police. A white person is calling the police because there is a black person, a dark-skinned person, somebody they don't think belongs there. Turns out that doesn't work anymore. We no longer live in a segregated society. So who is in the neighborhood is who's in the neighborhood.
You also mentioned briefly when you read the comments from the student, the importance of distinguishing among prejudice, bigotry, and racism. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. One of the things we've done when it comes to these discussions of intergroup issues, race relations, for example, we jam some concepts together or some ideas together. People love using the word racist. But what are you really talking about? Well, it turns out prejudice is not bigotry, is not racism, as I write in To Live Woke more than once, because I know it's something that people have jammed together. Prejudice is anti-group feelings. That is, you have feelings about a group, negative feelings about a group. Does that mean that your negative feelings have to come out in your behavior? Well, no. The well-socialized individual can sit with the stimulus that they don't like and be fine. That is, not show any sign of it. As soon as your anti-group feelings come out in behavior, calling the police, that's bigotry. Bigotry is a behavioral expression of anti-group feelings. I spent a lot of time on that in To Live Woke. So what is racism? People are always going racist. Well, it's so interesting that right now in America, we are suddenly focused in on the right thing when we talk about racism. Notice that the conversation does not move towards systemic racism. Well, that's what racism is. Racism is institutional and organizational structures that support individual prejudice and bigotry. So without that institutional support of prejudice and institutional support for prejudice and bigotry, people who have anti-group feelings walk around in the world now feeling really uncertain or assuming they have support and they don't. So my chapter on calling the police, so many examples of people calling the police because of an 8-year-old black kid is standing on the corner selling water. Okay, what? People are calling the police because black people are having a barbecue in a park. Okay, what in the old days you could get away with that. Whites could get away with that because there was institutional support for it. So now you do that and you end up like Amy Cooper and people are bringing charges for a false report. There is no institutional, there's not the same kind of institutional and organizational support for prejudice and bigotry that there used to be. And that's creating a lot of tension, creating a lot of uncertainty about how to interact, about how to proceed. But that's why it's important to distinguish prejudice from bigotry from racism. And what the George Floyd murder has done is make people focus a lot more on racism as a structural force.
All right, thank you. There's also something you teach your students that I think is really important, and I wish you'd speak to it a little bit. You say, there are no innocent, and I've heard you say, we're all monsters. Can you talk about that and why it's important for us all to acknowledge that?
W.H. Auden said this in a poem: evil is unspectacular and always human, shares our bed and eats at our own table. We all carry around prejudices. There is no one in the world who doesn't have a prejudice. and a group prejudice. Where does it come from? They don't know. They don't know. The feeling is there. It's come from their lack of experience or the things they've heard their parents say that they just processed as a kid. It's in you. Anybody who grew up in America has some racial stuff going on in their cognitive network. Some of it acknowledged, some of it unacknowledged. You can't get away from that. Likewise, gender. That's why people say, I'm fine, I can interact with any Black person. And then you turn to them and you say, what about transgender people? And they fall apart. Because they're carrying something around about groups that are right here in America that you have to interact with. We all carry something. So that means none of us are innocent. There are no innocent. The idea that whenever anybody talks about being above it all, they're in deep trouble because they're going to make a mistake. It's going to catch them like whiplash at some point. So the idea of talking about there are no innocent is to say to people, examine yourself, pay attention to your feelings, understand that they are irrational in some cases. And that's why it's important to say to my students over and over again, there are no innocent. And I include myself in that. I tell a story in here about language that has to do with a story, an interaction I had with a man who uses a wheelchair. Notice I said uses a wheelchair. Very interesting that I had to learn how to talk about that. And I learned it from him because at one point in our interaction, I said to him something about somebody being wheelchair bound. And his whole body shifted. He said, I am not wheelchair bound. I am not defined by my wheelchair. I use a wheelchair. I was like, okay. Did I know I had that? No. There are no innocent. Evil is unspectacular and always human.
Right. We've got a lot of questions here, and how about if I just pull one up from a person who says, this is from Karen, how do our daily interactions help break the larger systems of racism?
There we go. Extremism always starts small. So there's a lot going on that has to be fixed now because we've let it build. But let's take a case like Charleston. Dylan Roof kills 9 Black people. I talk about that. I have a chapter, Hesitation in Charleston. Dylan Roof said after he was apprehended, he said, I sat with those people and they were so nice to me. He said, I hesitated. But then he went on. What I say is, in that moment of hesitation, he heard no counter arguments. That is, no one in his life had ever said to him, the way you're talking about Black people is not right. And we know that because when his so-called friends were interviewed, they said, yeah, he used to say stuff like that. But we thought he was just joking. That's how we can have an impact on things that happen that are very big. That also means that we can do that with policymakers. Policymakers live in somebody's house. Policymakers interact with somebody in the coffee shop. But if policymakers never hear a counter argument in a civil way from a friend, from an acquaintance, it lives in them. And so it shows up in policies in ways that make us go, whoa, where did that come from? But then it's too late.
Okay, let me take a look at some of these other questions. As the term, this is from an anonymous attendee, as the term anti-racism becomes more common, what do you think is the most important thing a white person can do in their everyday life to be anti-racist?
One of the things that is really important, and I talk about this in the book, people say they want to be anti-racist, they want to be an ally. The first step in being an ally is self-examination. You are not all right. The history of race in America has blemished, wounded everyone's psychology. There are no innocent. And that's why I say this in To Live Woke in chapter 27 on the Call the Police chapter. Here's what I write about this. Page 175. I'll get it in a minute. Refusing to admit and examine your racial or other neurodiversity anxieties does not turn those anxieties into unconscious bias. You know what you feel. You are just engaged in dangerous denial. It is dangerous because the neurodiversity anxiety is sleeping right under the surface of our everyday social encounters. With the right situational noise, that neurodiversity anxiety will roar awake from its hibernation, and in panic, someone will call the police. The problem today is not race relations per se, or unconscious bias. Too many of we Americans have become sneeches, so frantically worried about whether this one was that one or what one was who, that for no good reason, the police are called. The problem is getting people to admit, acknowledge, and examine the origins of and manage their neurodiversity anxiety. That is an anxiety about who belongs in what space. That is an anxiety about who are among the we and who are among the they. That is the anxiety that is the American intergroup problem of our time, our newest American dilemma. To be an ally means you've done self-examination.
Okay. Here's a question from somebody. In the university setting, how can students speak up against racist and prejudiced comments and behaviors from superiors, e.g. faculty and administration?
Well, one of the things is you always have to choose your moments, and power matters. So document it. If you're in a classroom where someone has done it, there are a couple ways to do this. There was an incident last spring, I think, maybe last fall. What is this? I'm losing time. I don't know what this is. Anyway, we had a professor in a physics class who made some demeaning comments about women. In the moment, the women spoke up and videotaped it. And 2 weeks later, he was fired. Okay, so that's one thing. However, not everybody's going to be willing to do that or know how to do that. So the other way to do it is, if this is happening in a classroom, there are other people there who are noticing it. Find those other people, document it, and then use our bias reporting system. You can report these things through a bias reporting system at NC State, at least. You can do so anonymously, and the university has to act on it. So that's one of the things about fighting systemic racism. You have to build systems to fight systems. And that's one of the things, one of the ways we have tried at NC State to do it. We got a lot more work to do, so don't misunderstand it. But that's how you do it. That's one of the ways you can do it.
Great, okay, let's see what else we've got here. Let's see. It says, I got into an argument with a family member when I said some negative things about people with wealth who don't need to work for what they have and how it's not fair. The person said I was bigoted against rich people. Is this possible?
Yes.
I didn't mention anyone in particular. Just
stop right there. Yes, let me deal with this. One of the first principles of my class is never try to interact with a person as a representative of a group. As soon as you do that, I don't care what the group is. This is not just about race. This is about using group stereotypes. As soon as you do that, you've used a stereotype. Never try to interact with a person as a representative of a group. Prejudice is not bigotry, it's not racism. Prejudice is anti-group feelings against a group, not against Black people. It could be against wealthy people. If those feelings come out in behavior, and verbal behavior is behavior, bang, that's verbal bigotry against rich people.
The answer is yes. All
yes.
right.
That's right.
Let's see. I'm not sure how to, okay. I'm trying to figure out how to scroll down here. This says, could you maybe expand a little bit more about ableism and how folks can be more aware of that in their everyday vocabulary?
Oh, yeah. One of the things about neurodiversity is we are now being put in situations where we interact with people who the society used to shun to the side. So when you talk about ableism, people with certain physical limitations, people with certain mental health limitations, we used to push those people to the side. Well, that's not what we're doing anymore. So you come to our university and we have disability services office. That means we have students with, we know, are physical limitations. How we interact with those people is not something that we typically have helped our young people know how to do. So they come to campus or you walk around town with a language. People think it's funny to say something is retarded. It's not funny. People, we use all kind of, we have to start examining our language tendencies as the first thing. That's that part of that self-examination. You want to be an ally, check yourself. And it's work. I mean, it means paying attention, finding those tendencies in yourself where they show up. You say you want to work with, I really like helping kids with special needs, but then you use language. You have to pay attention to things like language.
Speaking of language, one of the questions is, can you describe exactly what you mean by woke?
This is Trevor Noah's fault. No, okay. I actually thank Trevor Noah in my acknowledgments, even though I never met the man. Two things happened. I had a student who wrote a paper about woke culture. And what she said was, she says it's very in to be woke nowadays. But she's reflecting on something I taught in the class. But I've noticed, she said, that a lot of people who call themselves woke use that to speak ill of other groups. It's like, oh, not quite woke. Because woke is supposed to be aware of all this stuff. And then Trevor Noah, I found on Facebook, did a bit on people being too woke. Where somebody has just overreacted to everything that might be kind of in a group. And that caught my attention. Those two things together caught my attention. And I started to realize that a lot of young people, college students, use the word woke. What I'm getting at is, if you want to talk about being woke, it's not self-congratulatory. So in the book, I tell the story, a bit of the story of my parents' relationship to social justice. My father was a janitor and bus driver, but also a voting rights activist. My mother was a school teacher who did side things to help Black children. They would never have called themselves woke. They would say, this is what you have to do. I don't call myself woke. I say I became woke, and what that meant to me was realizing that there are things I could do, not things that I could declare, things that I could do to help America in its struggle, help my students, help a lot of different folks. So to be woke is to do the social justice work without being concerned about being self-congratulatory. I'm all woke, you know. No, you're not.
Okay, here's an interesting question. During this time of social distancing and not being able to see others, is it better to send an apology to those you may have offended with past mistakes, or to better yourself during this time and showing it?
Okay, the second one. Better yourself during this time and show it. So, an apology now is too late. What you want to do is you acknowledge this to yourself. Because an apology now is you trying to redeem yourself. That's not the way to go at this. Admit to yourself you really screwed up. Now, how do I put myself in a position where I don't make that same kind of mistake again? What do I need to do? There's a lot of talk right now, of course, about books to read. And I think that's a really good way to begin exploring yourself. Not every book is a good book to read, but trying to find books that help you understand not only yourself, but yourself in the world of race, in the world of genderism, in the world of heterosexism. That's really important. And so right now, the thing to do is use this time for self-exploration, self-challenge, and that becomes betterment.
Okay. I'm going to throw in one of my questions because I think it's important that we cover this. In the book, you state, and I quote, "Extremism grows strongest when prejudice is expressed in behavior that goes unchallenged," like you were talking about with Dylan Roof.
Right.
And you present a strategy to use when you are confronted with bigoted behavior. And I think it would be really important just to hear some of that strategy so people can have a takeaway with what they can do when they're confronted with that.
When I was first teaching my course, one of the things that came up was, what do I do now that I know? And just at that time, it's funny, 2007, there was a journal article published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology that nobody other than a social psychologist would ever read because it's filled with statistics. But they did a set of experiments to address the question, or to explore the question, how do you handle a moment of bigotry in your social interactions? And what they came to was this really, what I consider profound strategy. It's profound because it's not an attack strategy. It does not rely on you calling people out. What it relies on is you saying to people what you prefer for them, for this interaction to continue. So somebody says, "That's retarded," and you're like, "Oh, you know, you're a don't do that." Don't do that. Don't do that. The way to do it is to take a deep breath, because you've had a reaction, and then say, "I'm sorry. I find that kind of language," and you can do it a number of things. I find that kind of language, I find that way of talking about people as a stereotype, I find that whatever it is, offensive. It hurts me. And then stop talking. What is so interesting about that strategy, I find that kind of language offensive. It hurts me. You know, I don't like hearing that kind of language. It hurts me. And then you stop talking. You don't argue. This is how I want you to know how this makes me feel and how I want us to deal with each other. The interesting thing about the results of that experiment was the effect that had on the person who had expressed the bigoted behavior. With that simple statement, the person who's been the perpetrator has heard this and now experiences negative self-evaluations. The person feels disgusted with themselves. That's one of the items. A number of things like that. And it means it pushes them into self-evaluation. When I describe this to my students and I describe the results, I say, "Well, why did this happen? Why does it have this effect?" My students say, "Well, because it means you feel like you misjudged the person you were interacting with." And there you go. Just that. And what that does is now, the other thing my students figure out is that means that every time the person now is about to say something like that, they've got a negative stimulus attached to it now. It gives them some hesitation. So that's the strategy. I find that kind of language offensive. I don't like to hear that. It hurts me. That's it.
And sometimes I think in some of you have some really wonderful examples of your students using that strategy. And sometimes the person who's challenged reacts defensively.
Yes.
And you have a strategy for dealing with that.
Of course. So one of the things about these conversations is you can't force people, you can't change people in the moment. What you can do is control your willingness to interact with this person. So you made your statement, the one I just gave you, and the person is going at you. You look them in the eye and say, "I've made my statement." They keep going at you, walk the hell away. You do not have to interact with people. Why? We all choose who we interact with. Every one of us does. We don't like to think about that, but we choose. I do this. You go to a party. First off, you don't want to be there. But now you got to interact with people. And then somebody comes up to you and they're annoying as hell. Of course, I know that doesn't happen to anybody who's on with us today. It's to me. And so now you got to figure out a way to get out of that interaction. My point is we choose who we interact with. And sometimes at a party, we'll say to somebody, "Excuse me, I got to go over here." It's the same thing.
Yeah. All right. Dr. Nacoste, I'm leading a group of my fellow medical students in a book club discussing race in America. As a group of almost physicians, what is your advice on how best we can address racism in the spaces in which we move? Besides checking our own biases, what can we do best to best help our Black, Indigenous, and other patients of color?
Okay, so never interact with a person as a representative of a group. Interact with that person. What is their case? What are their issues? What do they seem to need? Give people a chance. So physicians, one of the things physicians need to do in this context, and any context really, is listen. Sorry. You got the technical information, but you don't know enough about the person's life yet. So listen. And one of the things we know from the Journal of the American Medical Association is that physicians are carrying these stereotypes they don't know they're carrying or aren't willing to address that they're carrying. And they don't listen because of the stereotype. This is a Black woman. Yeah, she doesn't feel much. This is okay. Even if the person doesn't say that out loud, the stereotype is driving the decision-making tree they're using for this particular patient. That's why you have to address it. But all of us have to address it, and physicians are in positions of power that affect people's lives. And so as a group, if you've got a group of people, start talking about that. What are your stereotypes? What are the ones you have to work on? Admit that to each other so you know you're not in this alone. Don't just think, well, okay, we'll do better. No, you have to address these issues, and you have to find a circle of people where you can bring that out of yourself and each other.
There's a really good book, Black Man in a White Coat by Damon Tweedy, who is a Raleigh-Durham author. I would also recommend reading to get some more insight into that too. Okay, so I don't know what this is, so I'm gonna just read it out loud. What are your opinions on cancel culture?
Oh God.
And what can we do to help facilitate conversations instead of canceling?
Right. Again, cancel, what I've learned is, are you still with me?
Yep. I think we're still here.
I'm gonna keep talking. So cancel culture, the idea that people are quick to say that this is somebody we never have to deal with again. Here's what I say about that. My father worked with ex-Klansmen. The idea that people can't change is an awful idea. The idea that we can't give people a chance to change is an awful idea. So people make mistakes. If they are a friend of yours, that's time for a conversation. Cancel culture is also this thing that's distant from real people. It says, so some celebrity has done something, people say, they're canceled. Okay, that's fine. I don't care about that at all. What I care about is the way people use it in their everyday social interactions about who they're going to interact with and deal with. If we want to change these dynamics in our lives and in our society, we have to understand that not everybody is in the same place. Everybody grows at a different rate. Some people have not had a chance to grow, didn't know they needed to grow, but now they are starting to grow. So one of the things about cancel culture right now is people are saying, well, some of these people, they never said anything before now. All of a sudden they want to be woke. No. All of a sudden they want to try to understand. And those are people we need to bring into the conversation and not push away. And I know that that's going on.
Okay, let's see. Okay, does the strategy for addressing a bigoted comment also apply for bystanders witnessing the comment addressed to a person in the group being prejudiced against? For instance, a racist comment made towards a Black or Indigenous person or of color. If not, do you have another suggestion for intervention?
Well, the thing is, people have to learn to speak for themselves. So that's one thing. If it's in a group that you're interacting with and somebody says something about somebody in the group who's right there, they need to speak for themselves. It's not your job to save people. Careful of the savior complex. And if they walk away from it and you don't like it, that's another conversation. Now, I think that's all I have to say about that. People have to learn how to speak for themselves. If it's distant, that is, if people are talking about somebody who is not there and they're doing it, then you're there, then yes, use the same strategy.
Okay. Here's a question. Going back to the walk away comment, what if instead that person wants to engage in a dialogue in an appropriate way? Would you do so in that moment or say that's for another time?
Well, it depends.
To try to change, should you take that on?
Well, it depends. You're not going to change them in the moment, but if they want to have a real conversation, I'd give some room for that if it's not an argument. Again, if it's not a set of arguments against, well, you're wrong, because that's not what you're talking about. You're saying this is how it is. This is how it hits me. If they come at you, and my students talk about this, and say, well, why do you care? That's not a civil conversation. They are trying to get you to back off. That's not a civil conversation. If they are saying, oh, I didn't understand how that could feel. How did you get to that point? That's a conversation. But anything that's an argument, walk the hell away.
Okay. This says, what role does the media, television and newspapers play in creating more anxiety and hostility about various groups of people?
Oh my God, that's all they do. I mean, the way stories are told, the way images are used. Right now, for example, I'm a news hound and I'm not watching the news because everything is told in a way that's us versus them, that's tension filled, and it just comes into your cognitive net in ways that influence you if you're not very careful. So the media has a powerful influence on American culture, society, and ways of interacting. That's a huge problem, which is why we have to control our own use of media, control the use of media by our children, and talk to our children about how media can influence them. Because a lot of young people walk around thinking that they're comedians. You know, Jerry Seinfeld said it, so I can say it. No, you can't. No, you can't. It's just a joke. No, it's not. So.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions, I think. Here's one. I have parents whose first language is not English, and it's very difficult to discuss their prejudicial views and explain to them why the Black Lives Matter movement has to happen. Do you have any advice on how to discuss difficult topics with ESL friends and family members?
Mm-hmm. Truth is, I don't know enough about that to say much except this. All you can do is let them see by your behavior that you care about this and keep doing that. Don't spend your time trying to convince them. It's the same thing with other kinds of family members. Family dynamics are very tough. So let them see who you are and how you engage in this time.
Okay. Somebody else asked if you have recommendations for a curriculum for middle school and high school students in terms of addressing these issues in a dynamic way.
Wow, no. I will say this. One of my students wrote a paper where she talked about the fact that when they came to talking about race in America in maybe middle school, they showed them animated films. Okay, don't do that. Because then it turns it into this fantasy that maybe happened. Now, you have to be careful about how you address the realities of the Jim Crow South, because it's horrible. But there are books. There's a nice book by Julius Lester called Let's Talk About Race. It's a picture book. And those kinds of books are important, I think, to use. I have not put together any kind of curriculum, so I can't speak to that.
Okay. I think we just have time maybe for one more. This is, as a white person with a trans relative, I'm deeply concerned about the murder of Black trans women. In what capacity, if any, can I, again, as a white person, engage with the conversation about anti-trans prejudice, bigotry, and violence in the Black community?
Okay, it depends on who you're interacting with. You can't go rushing into the Black community to tell people that they need to pay attention to this. That's not going to work. But if you have a friend, if you have someone that you are working with, and these kinds of issues are being discussed, then you can do it there. But you can't just, I can't just. One of the funny things, I speak to a lot of groups. I speak to a lot of groups in Raleigh. I speak to a lot of church groups. I've never, ever been invited to a Black church, ever. And there's a reason for that, because my reputation is that I'm going to challenge everybody. And I'm going to challenge people when it comes to issues of sexual orientation and so on, and how we should show people respect. So those institutions don't call me, and there's nothing I can do about that.
Okay. We're about at the end of our hour. Is there anything that we haven't talked about in regards to your book or the issue that you want to leave us with?
One of the things I've talked about in the book in chapter 39, American bigotry now is personal. In that chapter, I raised the question that America is struggling to deal with, that as a country, we have relied on false categories. I talked about this a little bit earlier. Why are there so many of these stories now where somebody is calling the police, somebody is freaked out because there's a Black person, somebody is standing in the street challenging a Black person about putting up a Black Lives Matter sign? What's going on is the institutional support, the pure institutional support that used to be there for prejudice and bigotry is gone. And so now people are walking around with all of this, who have a white superior orientation, with all of this uncertainty about what is my power. And they're trying to engage and act like they're still in charge. And that's causing a lot of trouble. American bigotry now, it's personal. What are you prepared to do?
Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time tonight. Thank you for everyone who attended. The book is To Live Woke. We have it at the bookstore. You can order online. Thank you again, Dr. Nacoste. Appreciate your being here.
You're welcome. That was fun.
All right. Great.
Take care, everybody.
All right. Good night.
Good night.